Hello. My business partner got my wife pregnant and tried to take over my company. My mom knew about it and still told me to raise the child. That's when I decided to go all out and take everything back. My name is Daniel. I am 38 and I run a small manufacturing company in Prague that produces precision metal components for medical equipment. My days usually start early at the factory and end late with paperwork or supplier calls. The company is not huge, but it is stable. 26 employees, long-term contracts, and a business partner who handled the finance side while I managed operations. My wife is Laura. She is 35 and works part-time in event planning. We had been married for 6 years and living together in a small house just outside the city. Laura always had a sharp personality, confident in public, but at home she could be cutting when she was irritated. I learned to filter most of it out and focus on work. My business partner was Victor, 41. We started the company together 9 years ago after leaving the same engineering firm. I trusted him because for most of that time the arrangement worked. I handled machines, clients, and production. He handled investors, banking, and contracts. For years the routine was predictable. I worked long hours. Victor managed the money, and Laura complained occasionally that I cared more about the factory than our weekends. Looking back, the first real shift was small enough that I ignored it. Victor began stopping by my house more often instead of discussing things at the office. At first it seemed normal. We sometimes reviewed numbers over dinner or coffee while Laura was around. Laura suddenly liked those visits. She started insisting Victor stay longer. She would open a bottle of wine, ask him about travel, about restaurants, about anything that had nothing to do with production schedules or supplier delays. I noticed something else too. The tone she used with him was completely different from the way she spoke to me. With me, she sounded impatient. With him, she sounded entertained. At the time, I wrote it off as harmless social behavior. Victor had always been more polished than I was. I am the guy who talks about machine tolerances at dinner. But there was one detail that stayed in my head longer than it should have. One evening, Victor left, and Laura stood by the window watching his car drive away. She did not know I was still in the hallway. The expression on her face looked less like friendliness and more like calculation. I ignored that too. At the time, I believed the real risk to my company was competition from larger manufacturers. I had no idea the real problem was already sitting at my own dinner table. The next few weeks gave me enough small reasons to be uneasy, but not enough to accuse anyone of anything concrete. That is probably the part people will question, so I will be clear. I did not see some dramatic affair scene. What I saw was a pattern of little things that stopped making sense. Laura started asking about the company in a way she never had before. Not about what I actually did, which she had spent years dismissing as boring, but about ownership percentages, access to accounts, signing authority, debt exposure, and what would happen if one partner wanted to force a buyout. That was not normal conversation for her. She framed it like casual curiosity, but Laura was not subtle when she thought someone around her was stupid. She would ask a question, watch my face, then follow up with something oddly specific, like whether Victor could approve certain transfers without me physically present or whether my mother still had a copy of my personal will from before the marriage. That last one caught my attention. My mother and Laura had a strained but polite relationship. Laura used to call her old school when she was being nice and controlling when she was not. The idea that Laura was suddenly thinking about paperwork connected to my family was strange on its own. Then Victor began pushing hard for structural changes at the company. He said we needed to modernize governance. That was his phrase. He wanted expanded financial authority so deals would move faster. He wanted a revised operating agreement. He wanted to bring in an outside consultant he knew to review our internal controls. The whole thing felt packaged. Victor had always been ambitious, but before that point he still acted like a partner. Now he talked like a man rehearsing for a takeover. At home, Laura got meaner in a very targeted way. Not random irritation. Directed pressure. She started calling me provincial because I still thought loyalty mattered in business. She said men who spend their lives on factory floors end up being managed by smarter people in jackets. She said Victor understood growth and I understood tools. I remember one dinner especially well because it was the first time I stopped trying to smooth it over. She had made reservations at a place I did not even know she liked. Victor was already there when I arrived because I had come straight from the plant after dealing with a broken milling unit. Laura looked annoyed before I even sat down. She told me I smelled like coolant and overtime. Victor laughed in that careful way people do when they want to look neutral while enjoying themselves. Then Laura leaned back and said I should be grateful someone like Victor knew how to make money off my hard work, because left alone, I would still be acting like a foreman with a loan. That was the first night I went home feeling less like a husband and more like I had walked into a meeting I was not supposed to understand. And a few days later, I found something in our kitchen trash that made all of it harder to explain away. What I found in the kitchen trash was not dramatic on its own. It was a folded medical paper with the clinic logo still visible at the top. Normally, I would not dig through trash, but the paper had been thrown out loosely and the clinic name caught my eye because it was one of the private facilities near our office district. Laura had gone there before for routine appointments. The page was a pregnancy test confirmation. The date on it was 3 days earlier. That immediately created a timing problem because Laura had not said a word to me. No conversation, no announcement, nothing. We had talked normally that entire week. So I did the simplest thing possible. I waited. That evening I asked her directly if she had been to the clinic that week. She looked at me like the question was stupid and said yes. Just a checkup. I asked if there was anything important she wanted to tell me. She rolled her eyes and said if I was about to turn into one of those paranoid husbands, she would gladly go stay at her sister's apartment. That answer told me two things. First, she already expected the topic to come up. Second, she was ready to shut the conversation down fast. I did not push it further that night. Instead, I watched what happened over the next few days. Victor suddenly began scheduling more private meetings with me about restructuring the company. He brought printed drafts of new ownership clauses. He talked about efficiency, capital expansion, and strategic control like someone giving a lecture. At the same time, Laura started acting almost amused around me. She would make little remarks about how life can change quickly, how people who think they control everything sometimes discover they are actually replaceable. One evening, she finally said it directly. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me she was pregnant. Her tone was not excited. It was more like she was presenting information in a meeting. I asked how far along. She said roughly 6 weeks. Then she leaned back and watched my face very carefully. The problem was simple math. 6 weeks did not line up with the last time Laura and I had been intimate. Not even close. I asked the question calmly because I wanted to see how she would respond. Who is the father? Laura did not answer right away. Instead, she smiled in a way that made the entire room feel different. Then she said something that made the rest of the situation suddenly connect in a way I had not expected. When I asked who the father was, Laura did not look nervous or defensive. She looked entertained. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms like someone waiting for a slow student to solve an easy problem. Then she said I should already know the answer if I was paying attention to my own life. I said I preferred direct information. Laura sighed loudly and said fine. Victor. She said his name like it was obvious. For a few seconds I just sat there and let the sentence settle. I was not shocked in the dramatic sense people expect. What I felt was more like the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place. The late meetings. The sudden interest in my company structure. The way she had been studying my reactions during conversations about control and ownership. I asked how long it had been going on. She shrugged and said long enough that I should probably start thinking about my next steps instead of asking pointless questions. That sentence was delivered with the same tone she used when telling a waiter the order was wrong. I asked if Victor knew. She laughed at that. Of course he knows. Then she added something that explained the strange shift in his behavior at work. She said Victor believed the situation would actually make things simpler. Her word was simpler. According to Laura, once the baby arrived, we would all need to behave like adults and adjust our lives accordingly. I asked what that meant exactly. She said it meant the company would eventually transition under Victor's leadership because he understood how to grow it properly. She said I could remain involved operationally if I wanted, but major financial decisions would obviously need to be centralized with someone more strategic. She said it like she was explaining a promotion structure. I asked if she was serious. Laura looked irritated now, like I was delaying an obvious outcome. She said I should try being practical for once in my life. Victor was the father of her child and also the person best positioned to run the company. Fighting reality would only make things messy. Then she added the part that made the entire conversation shift from insulting to strategic. She said my mother already knew about the pregnancy. And according to Laura, my mother had given her some advice about what I would probably do next. When Laura said my mother already knew, that was the first moment I actually felt something close to anger. Not loud anger. The quiet kind where your brain immediately starts replaying recent conversations looking for clues. I asked Laura exactly what she meant. She said a few weeks earlier she had lunch with my mother. According to her, the topic of the pregnancy came up and my mother had reacted much calmer than expected. Laura described the whole thing like two women discussing a complicated but manageable situation. Then she said the part that stayed with me. She said my mother believed that once a child is involved, the priority should be stability. Her word was stability. Laura explained it like this. My mother apparently assumed that even if the situation was messy, I would eventually accept it and raise the child anyway, because that is what responsible men do. According to Laura, my mother told her that I might be stubborn, but I had always cared about family reputation and long-term responsibility. So in her mind, the outcome was predictable. Laura leaned forward while telling me all this and watched my reaction like she was waiting for confirmation of a theory. Then she added something else. She said Victor believed the same thing. Victor apparently assumed that once the pregnancy was public, I would avoid a major conflict because it could damage the company reputation and scare off clients. His solution was simple. Transition leadership gradually, keep me in a technical role, and maintain the appearance of partnership. Laura said all of this calmly, like she was explaining a business plan that had already been approved. I asked her one direct question. Did either of them ever think about asking me? Laura rolled her eyes and said asking would only complicate things. People resist change when they think they have a choice. Then she said something that clarified how little she respected me at that moment. She said eventually I would calm down and realize this arrangement was actually generous. I remember standing up from the table very slowly. Not because I was emotional, because I wanted to be sure I understood the entire situation before doing anything stupid. My wife was pregnant with my business partner's child. My partner believed the situation would help him take control of the company, and my own mother believed I would simply accept it and raise the child to keep the peace. That night, I did not argue. I just left the house and started thinking about how much damage two confident people can do when they assume you will never fight back. That night, I did not go back inside the house. I drove around Prague for about an hour and then parked near the factory. When people hear this kind of story, they imagine shouting or some dramatic confrontation. That did not happen. The situation was already too clear for that. Instead, I started listing facts. Fact 1. Victor and I own the company 50-50 on paper, but operational control was not actually balanced. The production contracts, supplier relationships, and equipment financing were all tied directly to the operational side that I managed. Fact 2. Victor handled finances, but every large client had originally come through my engineering contacts from my previous job. Without production credibility, the contracts would not hold. Fact 3. The restructuring documents Victor had been pushing suddenly made perfect sense. He was preparing legal groundwork. Not immediately stealing the company, but slowly shifting authority until my role became replaceable. Fact 4 was the one that mattered most. Both Victor and Laura believed I would avoid conflict because of the pregnancy. They believed reputation and family pressure would trap me. I sat in the empty office above the production floor for a long time that night thinking about that assumption. Around midnight, I called the one person who understood the company structure better than anyone else besides Victor, our corporate lawyer. I did not explain everything. I just asked a simple question. If a partner begins planning structural changes that disadvantage the other partner, what is the fastest legal way to stop it? He asked if I suspected hostile movement inside the company. I said yes. That was enough for him to schedule a meeting the next morning. The next step was harder. I drove to my mother's apartment early the following day before work. I wanted to hear from her directly whether what Laura said was true. My mother opened the door looking surprised but not confused, which told me Laura had not lied about the conversation. I asked her one question. Did you tell my wife that I would raise another man's child to keep things peaceful? My mother hesitated for a moment. Then she said something that made it clear just how badly everyone had misread the situation. She said sometimes a man has to accept reality instead of destroying his life fighting it. That was the moment I realized something important. Everyone around me thought I was predictable, and that misunderstanding was about to become my biggest advantage. After that conversation with my mother, I stopped treating the situation like a family crisis. I started treating it like a hostile business maneuver. That shift in mindset made everything simpler. People assume betrayal creates confusion. In reality, it creates clarity. Once you accept that someone is actively working against you, their behavior becomes much easier to predict. I went to the factory straight from my mother's apartment and met our lawyer later that morning. This was not a dramatic meeting either. I laid out the structure of the company, the recent pressure from Victor to modify governance, and the proposed changes he had been pushing. Our lawyer read through the draft documents Victor had given me. He frowned after about 5 minutes. Then he asked if I realized what those revisions would actually do. I said I had a general idea. He explained it more clearly. The new structure would slowly shift financial authority toward Victor through procedural changes. Nothing illegal on its own, but over time it would allow him to approve major financial decisions without my direct signature. That meant loans, restructuring, even potential dilution if new investors appeared. In simple terms, Victor was preparing to control the company without technically removing me. My lawyer asked if Victor had already filed any of the revisions. I said no. That mattered, because it meant the window to act was still open. He suggested something Victor probably did not expect: a defensive restructuring. The production assets, machinery leases, and several key contracts were technically tied to operational entities that I personally supervised. If those relationships were legally reinforced in the right way, Victor would lose the ability to isolate the financial side from the operational core. In other words, the company would still exist on paper as a partnership, but real control would become much harder to steal. I asked how long that process would take. He said if we moved quickly, a few days. The timing mattered because Victor believed I was still processing the pregnancy news. Meanwhile at home, Laura continued behaving like someone who had already won. She started speaking openly about Victor's future plans for the company. She talked about expansion, new investors, and how our life would improve once leadership was in the hands of someone more strategic. She also began referring to the baby as something we would raise together. Not once did she ask if I agreed. That arrogance gave me exactly what I needed: time. And while they were busy planning their future, I started quietly rearranging the foundation underneath their plan. The next week moved faster than Victor expected. While he was busy preparing his version of the company's future, our lawyer and I finalized a defensive restructuring that locked the operational core of the business under protections he had not accounted for. The machines, the production leases, the maintenance contracts, and several of the supplier agreements were legally reinforced through a holding structure that required my direct authorization for any structural changes. It did not remove Victor as a partner, but it made the kind of quiet takeover he had planned almost impossible. He found out 3 days later. Victor called an emergency meeting at the office the moment he saw the filings. His voice on the phone was unusually calm, which told me he was already angry. When I walked into the conference room, he had several printed documents on the table. He asked if I wanted to explain why I had restructured the operational assets without discussing it first. I told him the same reason he had drafted governance changes without discussing them: preparation. Victor tried to keep the conversation technical at first. He said my move complicated future financing and limited flexibility. I listened for a few minutes and then asked him something much simpler. Did you honestly believe I would help you take my company? That was the first moment his expression changed. Not denial, just annoyance that the conversation had reached the real topic faster than he preferred. He admitted the pregnancy made the situation complicated, but insisted we could still work out a reasonable arrangement if I stayed calm. That word again: calm. I told him the restructuring was already filed, and there would be no transition of leadership. The partnership would continue under the original structure, or it would dissolve legally. Either way, the operational core was no longer vulnerable. Victor realized the window had closed. He stopped arguing after that. When I got home that evening, Laura was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone. She looked up and immediately asked if Victor and I had finalized the leadership changes yet. The confidence in her voice was almost impressive. I told her the plan was finished, just not the one she expected. Then I explained what the restructuring meant and that Victor's takeover attempt was over. Laura stared at me for a moment like she was waiting for the punchline. When she realized there was none, her tone changed instantly. She said I was being petty and short-sighted. She said Victor would never trust me again and that I had just damaged the company's future because of my ego. I told her something simple: this house belonged to me before the marriage, which meant something else. She had about an hour to pack a bag and go stay with the father of her child. Laura did not pack immediately. Instead, she laughed. It was the kind of laugh someone uses when they believe the other person is bluffing. She leaned against the counter and told me I was acting dramatic. According to her, kicking a pregnant wife out of the house would make me look like a monster. I told her something very simple. The child was not mine, the house was, and the father lived 15 minutes away. That finally removed the confidence from her face. She switched tactics quickly. Laura always did that when something stopped working. First came the insults. She called me small-minded and vindictive. Then came the threats about how ugly things could get legally if I tried to abandon a pregnant spouse. I reminded her again that paternity tests exist and that Victor would probably be very interested in signing the paperwork himself. That ended the legal argument. What followed was 30 minutes of angry pacing while she stuffed clothes into a suitcase and complained about how short-sighted I was being. She kept repeating that Victor and I could still fix the business situation if I stopped acting emotional. I did not respond. I simply watched the clock. Eventually, she zipped the suitcase and dragged it to the door. Before leaving, she turned around and said something that confirmed exactly why she had been so confident before. She said my mother would never support what I was doing. I told her that was a conversation I would handle myself. Then she left. The house became very quiet after that. The next step was straightforward. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my phone, and blocked Laura's number. Then I blocked her email and every social media account connected to her. After that, I did the same thing with Victor. People will probably ask why I did that instead of continuing the conversation. The answer is simple. Once the legal and business boundaries were set, there was no value in further discussion. They had already explained their plan clearly. I had already responded. Dragging the situation through weeks of arguments would only create new problems. Blocking them forced everything into formal channels where emotions did not matter. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. But the situation was not completely finished yet. Because the next morning my phone started ringing from a number I had not blocked. And the person calling was my mother. My mother rarely calls early in the morning, so when I saw her number on the screen, I already knew Laura had contacted her. I answered, and she immediately asked what I had done. Not hello. Not how are you. Just that question. She sounded frustrated, the way she does when she believes someone younger is making a reckless decision. According to her, Laura had arrived at Victor's apartment late the previous evening and explained everything. My mother said I had escalated the situation unnecessarily. I let her finish before responding. Then I explained the situation as simply as possible. My wife had an affair with my business partner. She was pregnant with his child. Both of them believed they could use the pregnancy to pressure me into surrendering control of the company while I quietly raised the child to keep appearances stable. My mother interrupted and said the pregnancy still mattered. That was the same word she used earlier. Stability. She said destroying my marriage and my partnership at the same time would damage my life more than accepting a difficult reality. I told her something she did not seem to understand before. There was no marriage left to preserve. Laura had already chosen the father of her child and tried to help him take my company. Continuing the arrangement would not create stability. It would create permanent leverage against me. That was not a family. That was a trap. My mother was quiet for a moment after that. Then she asked what I planned to do next. I told her the truth. The legal separation paperwork was already being prepared. The company partnership would either continue under the existing structure or dissolve through formal negotiation. Either way, the attempted takeover was finished. She did not argue after that. We ended the call calmly. In the weeks that followed, Victor stopped trying to push structural changes. Without the leverage he expected, the situation became far less simple for him. Lawyers replaced friendly meetings. Laura never contacted me again directly. Looking back now, the strangest part of the whole situation was how confident they were at the beginning. They believed I would choose comfort over confrontation. They believed reputation would matter more to me than control over my own life. What they misunderstood was simple. Once someone shows you exactly how they plan to use you, the decision becomes very easy. You stop negotiating, and you start closing doors. Bye-bye.